Hello and welcome everyone to our 30-second office hour. This is on ITSM, Vendor Manager Workspace, Best Practices Overview. We have our senior subject matter expert, David Thickman, who's going to be walking us through some of the best practices and other topics related to vendor workspace management. One of the areas I want you guys to kind of think about in terms of our format, I say this every single time, but just want to make sure you guys understand. The first 30 minutes, really all about David or the senior subject matter expert invited to kind of talk through the different topics that are there, kind of lay the groundwork, et cetera, so that then the remaining 30 minutes we'll actually be able to have our open mic kind of session where you can have different types of levels of questions and answers. Any questions that you guys have, feel free to put those into the chat window. I'll help facilitate some of those questions. If it is a question, though, that you would like to have David take a pause as he's going through those items, I'll reach out and just say, hey, David, just can you take a quick pause? Here's a quick question that's related to the topic that you're on right now, and see if he can kind of go through that. But outside of that, it's pretty much just open forum for there. Any customers who are reviewing these videos, if you guys have any questions, feel free to hit me up on my email address, charles.rayburn, R-A-Y-B-U-R-N, at servicenow.com. And I'll try to reach out to get some additional answers for you for those items. So thank you so much. All right, David, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit further, and then we can get started.
Yes, I mentioned to the folks, Charles, actually before you were here, that I was a product manager at ServiceNow, and I'm responsible for the Vendor Manager Workspace, also the Continual Improvement Management product as well, but that's kind of a new thing. I've been at ServiceNow for 9.5 years, so I'm a bit of a veteran as far as this is concerned. I started off in the VPC community, which is part of our implementation group, and then moved over into product management about 4 years ago. Charles mentioned that we have a small group today. I had planned on Q&A at the end, but I think with a group this size, we can manage questions as we go along. So please do feel free to jump in. I want to point out our safe harbor notice. This just says that I might make some projections today, but I'm never making a promise. So we're doing all this in good faith, and I know that you guys are anxious to see some of the things about where we may be going with vendor management. So that's that. Loosely, we'll do an overview around sort of where our thinking is around vendor management. We'll talk a little bit about roadmap. We'll do a pretty quick demo. And then I've got a slide around some what I call implementation hints, because there's a lot of background data that goes into the Vendor Manager Workspace. And basically what the Workspace does is go out into the ServiceNow, into the platform, and pull that data forward. So and then I said here, Q&A at the end. We can certainly do that, but if you've got a question along the way, please just go ahead and speak up. So as mentioned before, we're here to talk about the Vendor Manager Workspace and how that could be hopefully leveraged by your organization. All right, so we've been working on this workspace for a couple of years now. And the fact is that none of our organizations really exist in isolation anymore from a business perspective. That's not necessarily bad, because it allows your company and other companies to focus on core competencies. But it does create a challenge, because if your vendor has a problem, then it can quickly become your problem. So we want to understand our vendors, track how they're performing, get rid of ones perhaps that aren't performing to where we expect them to be. So as the number of vendors has grown, so has that potential for what we call critical service problems. And tracking performance is intended to highlight service problems and maybe even give us leading indicators. Today, a lot of work is done by emails and phone calls and text messages. Tracking performance is done with Excel spreadsheets or just local documents emailed around, or et cetera. It's all very unstructured, and it's hard to provide transparency into those vendor performance metrics, if you will. So the recognized need to manage vendors, both risk and performance, is growing rapidly, especially in the context of this last year right? Don't have to go into that, and moving to work from everywhere kind of dynamics. So organizations' IT spending for so-called third-party platform technologies and services rose dramatically. Today, generally there are only rudimentary tools. There's poor visibility. A lot of the processes are manual, and there's no real vendor alignment with business priorities. Now, I'm not saying that our vendor manager workspace solves all these problems all at once, but the journey that we're on is to do just that. Because a lot of what we heard when we interviewed around 60 different customers is that they are challenged with assessing that vendor performance for a number of reasons. First, the metrics and information that make up performance are not clearly defined and may not be the same for all vendor engagements or even vendor types, right? So think of hardware vendors, software vendors, service vendors, what have you. Secondly, vendor performance metrics are often referred to as intangibles, right? And they're based on individual perspectives and opinions as opposed to contractual obligations. Thirdly, there are a number of individuals who engage with a vendor during that vendor's life cycle in different capacities and at different times, and all feedback and experience must be considered in that overall performance assessment. So it's all well and good to have SLAs and know the number of incidents and so forth, but people's experience with a vendor and the services or hardware or whatever that vendor provides is very important as well. Fourth, because vendor performance data is not captured anywhere and occurs kind of ad hoc as individuals engage and work with a vendor, we lack a mechanism for gathering this data and doing an empirical sort of analysis, if you will, or an empirical understanding of a vendor's performance. So I mentioned opinions and I mentioned empirical data. So what our vendor manager workspace does is kind of pull that together. Right now, customers do this in a lot of ways, or try to do this in a lot of ways. They use surveys. They collect input during regular like reviews with vendors. Sometimes they'll overhear employees and coworkers talking about vendor failures, and sometimes they'll get direct feedback via email or other mechanisms. And then they try to document this and pull this all together. And they document it in Excel sheets or notes or whatever. Generally, without a system in place, assessment of that vendor performance comes down to an opinion. And so the vendor manager workspace is intended to be really focused on this monitoring capacity of the life cycle of a vendor. So if we look at this blue bar across the middle, identify, evaluate, onboard, monitoring, most of the time, most of our time with our relationship with any given vendor is in this monitoring phase, right? It may be a Google search to identify, evaluate, and select, and onboard maybe a few weeks. But when we sign a contract and we go into this relationship, we're probably in there for a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe more. And so that's where the monitoring is occurring, and that's where our workspace really is a focus. We've got plans in the future. We'll talk about this maybe a little bit in the roadmap to really look into the end of the life cycle to be able to compare vendors against each other, compare the performance of a vendor against their contractual obligations, and use this data that we've been using for monitoring to also help us from a decision perspective when it comes to renewing or terminating contracts. Not quite there yet, but as far as the tools supporting that capability, but the data is being collected that would help to support renew or terminate decisions. What I'm going to be showing is basically a Roam version of the vendor manager workspace. This is a screenshot. You can see our outcomes that we're driving for on the right-hand side. But this is, as I mentioned, using our current workspace technology, but this is in the process of being migrated. So let me stop sharing that, and I will pop over to my browser. While I'm doing this, Charles, how are we doing?
We're doing good so far. No questions. I did pause the recording during your roadmap discussion because we are going to be posting the recording on the community page.
Oh, okay.
But we're good to go. I'm recording again, so you have plenty of time. Take your time.
Wow. Well, I saw some people writing some things down, so I'm sure that
Yeah,
everybody's got a good idea. That's good. That's why we're here, right? So you can know these things.
you bet.
Okay. So this is as I, as a vendor manager, and I start up the workspace, I get this view, and this is what we call our landing page. And so it used to be that basically, as a vendor manager, I would go to see my list of vendors, and I could go into any one of them individually and see how they were performing or what was going on or whatever. And that was good. But the thing is, I had to go into each one of them individually. So what we've done here is created a landing page, kind of a dashboard, but basically it's pulling together about all of the vendors that I manage. And I manage means I'm listed on the vendor, the vendor record as the vendor manager, the primary contact internally. And you can see this is pretty basic information, but this is a starting point. Organizations are going to, especially starting in the San Diego timeframe, probably want to add some things, take some things away. But this is our starting point for our landing page. Across the top, we've got how many metric models are being used by the vendors I manage, contract information, especially contracts that are ending in the very near future, improvement initiatives that are in flight right now around my vendors, et cetera. You can see the performance score diagram on the left. Cloud MSP's got really good, interesting data because they're jumping all over the place. The rest of my vendors down here, not so much. And then vendor satisfaction by vendor. This is really, vendor satisfaction is a component of the performance score, but we thought it was important to kind of drive it up higher so it could be more prominent. Success indicators, I'll go into a little bit of depth on these in a moment, but the success indicators, this view of success indicators is where are my vendors in the total universe of vendors that my company deals with, how are they doing? And which of my vendors is doing the best amongst that universe of other vendors. My vendors is a simple list, and then catalog items down at the very bottom. If you've set up vendor catalog items and they've been in your request catalog and they're being executed, those will show up in this list here. I'm sorry, I don't have data there. But that being the landing page, then the vendor home is where I, as a vendor manager, can drive into all the vendors that I manage and then see not only their basic data in a list view here, but I can drive into the vendor manager workspace proper, as it were. And there's a lot of pieces going on here, so I'll try to kind of work my way across the page and hopefully can do so in a manner that is comprehensive. So up here at the top, we've got the high level basic information about this vendor, what their current score is, which is in many places. Where's my okay. Anyway, this a color indicator score, what risk tier they're in, what type of vendor they may be, who's the manager, and metric model that they're using. Now, some of this may seem a little bit redundant, but if I was coming into this record from a list that showed all vendors and I was the CIO, it would be good for me to be able to see who is the vendor manager, David Thigpen. This main part of the page here is what we call the vendor profile. So the vendor profile is a tab within the workspace, and the profile contains all of the performance information that I've been referencing off and on since our discussion started. My current vendor score with a chart showing how that's moving up or down. This piece here is a list of the metrics and their weighting that contribute to that score. Each of those is represented in this little piece of the profile and how they are changing up or down. And then I've got additional metrics. Additional metrics, let me back up, each metric model has pieces that are used to calculate the score and then additional metrics that we're monitoring that we may want to add to that performance score calculation at some point, but for now are just for information, right? Maybe I've got something special for a single vendor that I want to kind of keep track of, or a single type of vendor, but I don't want to include it into the overall performance score that all vendors are measured by. In any case, these are really flexible. You can add and remove metrics, not only from the additional metrics part, but also from the performance score part, and adjust their weighting. Those are based on performance analytics indicators, generally speaking, and so there's a lot of flexibility there. And then here's a list of what are the lowest performing service offerings by performance score. Service offerings, kind of an important concept. We're really tightly aligned with service definitions and service offerings, and the measurement of those as an input of how well a vendor is doing. However, a lot of organizations haven't done a lot of work around defining services and offerings quite yet. And so we're moving in the future to kind of split off vendor management from service ownership and have vendor management a little bit more independent, and not so dependent on understanding of this service offering performance, because that's another one of those data elements that has to be configured and managed, et cetera, and that can cause some hindrance to making some of this work. Now, I mentioned vendor profile as a tab. Here's another tab, service offerings. And as I go through this part of the workspace, basically what I'm doing is reaching into ServiceNow, and the references to my vendor I'm pulling forward into this interface. So all service offerings that have been defined as being provided by this vendor, any contracts related to them, improvement initiatives that have been created, service credits that have been created, SLA definitions, and other things kind of off this follow-on menu down at the end can be visited as well. And of course, all these are clickable. You can drive into any one of these items to get a view into those records. And the order of this is basically defined over on the platform side. Off to the right, I have what's called the vendor details. Now, what this does really is set the context and reminder to the vendor manager exactly what the details are around the vendor, in this case, providing these service offerings. The key part of this, or a couple of key parts, one of them is if I've got vendor risk enabled, then I get an insight into the vendor risk rating for this vendor. Otherwise, it's pretty basic information. The big value add to me is, I don't know why it's disappearing, is this list of contacts here, because then I can click into other external contacts and get information about what their phone number is, what their email is, and if I'm having trouble with a vendor, that's where I go to find out who I need to call. And so I think that's really a big part of it. I mentioned total cost of contracts earlier. All this does is add up the contract values that are listed in the contract table. I believe there was a question about contracts that came through. We'll get to that in a bit. And this is basically the vendor details is information that resides on the core company table record, or vendor table. In addition, if I've got attachments for this vendor, they're listed here, but we also have our success indicators. Success indicators, as I mentioned earlier, is our leveraging of the correlation engine within our predictive intelligence capability. And what happens is, for a given instance or company, we define, here are the criteria that we want to be evaluated across our vendor landscape to tell us which criteria indicates a vendor is likely to be successful, right? And so you can use any number of inputs into that correlation engine. Contract value, you can use location, you can use the metrics that are being measured, you can use the contacts, whatever it may be. And the correlation engine will come back and say, well, based on the performance of your vendors and the data that you input as possible correlation factors, here are the ones that make that seem to indicate whether a vendor will be successful or not, or more successful or less, is probably a better way to say it. And each of these has the capability to drive into it and get more information via this little see more button. And so average customer satisfaction. Now this one's a little bit self-evident. If I've got high average customer satisfaction, that's likely to be an indicator of high vendor performance. Okay, that's kind of a little bit obvious, but across the top here, for this company that we were just looking at, this is their customer satisfaction rating. As a vendor manager, my best vendor is doing 71% as far as customer satisfaction. And as a company, of all the vendors that we're managing, demo vendor 37 is number one with 79%. And then down here we have lists that can be, adjusted to show the worst or the best of my vendors from a customer satisfaction perspective. And then I can pop over here, see all the vendors that are being measured this way and rank them, et cetera, and see their scores as well. And so what we see this as, in addition to being, giving us insight into performance, it also is a capability that maybe says, if I've got something as part of my success indicators that says these factors indicate high performance, I probably need to go back and revisit my metrics model and make sure those metric models include those indicators or include that information and use that as an input into customer satisfaction. See if I can find a little bit better example of that. Let's see. So if I say that it seems to be that the companies that are based in the USA, I'm getting better performance out of today, then maybe I need to go back and somehow look and include that kind of information as part of my vendor score metric. Maybe it's if I'm sourcing from the US, I get a 1. If I'm not sourcing, I get a 0 or whatever. However you would input that in as part of your score metrics. But that could be an example of where now I take the information that's coming out of the correlation engine and alter my performance modeling and measurement. Generally speaking, that's the vendor manager workspace. So since we've got a little bit of time and an intimate group here, I'll just stop and see if there are any specific questions on this interface.
I just had one question, David.
Okay.
Thank you for the really great overview. So, I mean, this workspace is geared around vendors who are obviously service vendors as such, with service offerings or performance, those kind of things. Have you got anything in the roadmap where you're going to look at how to manage vendors more that are not service related? So say you've got vendors that worked as particular statements of work, or who are consultancy vendors, or those kind of groups, rather than actual service providers as such in the traditional
sense. So in a lot of ways, what you've, in my opinion, described, consultancy groups, they're service vendors as well. It's just that maybe our measurement mechanisms are a little bit less defined. If you might end up with, and let me see if I can. For example, I've got 2 example metric models here: IT services and IT hardware. From a IT hardware perspective, it would be how good is my request and fulfillment processes? Are they being is the vendor providing fulfillment on a timely manner, et cetera? Maybe things like warranty, et cetera. But for IT services, it's a little softer. It's more about have I met the commitments, et cetera. From a consultancy perspective, it would be and you can do some manual data here as well as all the automated components. But it would be, are we satisfied with the work that they provided? Have they met the the cost that they projected. Projects, are they being completed on time, whatever it may be. It's to me, it would be just a different set of metrics feeding into the model. And that might be, in your organization, rationale for creating a performance model specifically for consulting services, which would be completely legit.
And that can be done with the by adding data manually rather than having it working through the system and anything that's created through other tasks within there.
Correct. Basically, the performance is coming through performance analytics. Performance analytics has the capability of what we call a manual indicator. And so you could leverage that. I popped over to the platform side to show that there are, the number of vendor score metric models could be numerous. You would want to not have too many. You wouldn't want to get to the point where you had one per vendor. That would be unmanageable. But the ability to add a new metrics score model and do so by a different mix of metric indicators that are contributing to it, and different weightings of those metrics that are contributing to it is what we expect organizations to do. We have two starting points that come kind of out of the box, or maybe one. But anyway, IT hardware and IT services. And these metrics that we are using to contribute to those of performance score and satisfaction, and then the additional metrics that are defined down here, those are out of the box examples that we provide. But not all organizations are going to be able to leverage all those, because not all organizations are going to have SLAs configured in a manner that they can take advantage of. A lot of organizations do SLAs based on processes, right? So P1 incidents, 2-hour resolution, or what have you. No reference to vendors, no understanding of who's providing it. It's whether internal, external, whatever. I, as an incident manager, want everything resolved in 2 hours. This adds, when we talk about services provided, offerings, vendors providing those services and offerings, maybe a vendor's managing your incident process. Those nuances have to be thought through when it comes to these performance models and these additional metrics. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I think you're right. We have a lot of vendors who we're not necessarily getting automated data generated from within the various problem change records, etc. at the moment, that would give us that insight from incidents. So we're keen to look at other ways to be able to measure performance. So I think having something manual would be great.
Yeah, if you recall in my PowerPoint deck, there was a bullet point on current pain points. A lot of times vendors come in and grab a bunch of ServiceNow data, go take it somewhere, massage it, and come back to you and say, we're doing great. And that's one of the things we're trying to address, is say, not according to what I see, are you doing great? How did you come up with doing great? Right. And so things like our future review meetings will be able to review, rationalize why they think they're doing great versus why maybe you don't. Okay, I'm going to pop back over to just reference PowerPoint. And I want to share a little bit about some implementation hints. Now, I want to credit our customer success groups, the BPCs within that organization especially, for sharing this with me based on some of the things that they've seen with implementation around Vendor Manager Workspace. Basically, I think 3 different phases, basically getting more sophisticated along the way. And I'm not going to read all of this, but the basic phase 1 piece is you've got to understand, you got to have a system of record for your vendors. And in ServiceNow, there can be more than one product using the core company table. And there are ways to segregate out things that are going to be shown in the Vendor Manager Workspace via the vendor flag that's in that table. But you've got to, kind of cleanse that table and create a new source of truth. That doesn't mean that other products can also do the same, but there has to be a discussion and understanding of the data in the core company table, because that's where we're starting our discussion for the vendor manager workspace. Other parts of this, somewhat self-evident, roles and ACLs. There's a fairly good, there's basically a couple of different levels for vendor manager workspace. There's a vendor administrator that's sort of a product administrator, can modify things like those performance models, et cetera. And then there's a vendor manager role as well that gets assigned to anyone who's going to own and view data within the workspace. And then you want somewhat of a baseline of your current performance for your vendors. Generally, you can start doing that with satisfaction surveys and assessments. So that's phase one. Phase two is, okay, now that I've got my core company table kind of cleaned up, what does my model need to be? Even before that, how many models do I need? What vendors types am I dealing with that I may have data for or not have data for, and how am I going to organize that? So a thinking through of the types of vendors you're managing, or that are being managed rather, the data you have available to be evaluating those vendors within ServiceNow or otherwise, and how those need to be used together, how the weighting needs to be applied, what's important to your organization. Maybe SLA adherence is the number one thing. Maybe something else, maybe satisfaction is the number one thing. Whatever it may be, weighting those metrics appropriately to give that performance score calculation starting point. Configure those indicators, and then start monitoring and analyzing your vendor's health. Now, we play, a lot of the examples I've given and our current mindset is we're talking about IT vendors. There's no reason really we couldn't be talking about field service vendors or the cleaning crews that come in on the weekends or whatever it may be. You just have to realize where your data is coming from, how you're going to measure those, et cetera. And once again, that flexibility within the different metric models allows you to maybe even have vendors that aren't being measured in any way, or only being measured via assessments by your internal employees. And then phase three, start to lever continual improvement to find specific areas where vendors are doing okay or not so okay, but we still believe in them. We still want to have a relationship with them, but we need them to do a little bit better. And generally that's in performance. In some ways that might be in cost. It might be, we like working with you guys, but you're really a lot more expensive than the market seems to indicate you should be. So how can we maybe even use continual improvement and measure the cost of services provided to decrease that over time? So that's a phased approach, but it's really also kind of assuming that a lot of your existing processes are reasonably mature, right? Your incident processes, change, et cetera, are reasonably mature, referencing either vendors or service offerings, et cetera. And so that data kind of flows into our workspace. I'd like to point out some other resources that are available, namely our Now community. And out there, there's a much longer version of that three-pronged approach that I just showed, kind of I won't say step-by-step, but an implementation roadmap, if you will, and some other implementation resources, as well as references to docs and podcasts, et cetera, that you may find interesting. So that said,
there is one question that popped up already. Linda, if you wanted to go ahead and ask that question, you can go ahead and do that. Perfect timing.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you, David, for the good overview. My question is about the phase one in the previous slide or a couple of slides back. You noted number 5 in phase one, measure stakeholder satisfaction with assessments and surveys. Are there assessments and surveys built into ServiceNow and the vendor?
Yes, assessments and surveys is a base capability in the platform. And there's a module within Vendor Manager Workspace specific for assessments of vendors. It's basically a starting point with a few starting questions to ask. And the idea here is I've got a defined set of stakeholders for a given set of vendors. So maybe for my financial system, my financial system support vendor, my stakeholder is obviously enough the finance group or the accounting team or whatever it may be. And so they are defined as stakeholders. And then I go and do an assessment to ask those stakeholders how that vendor is doing. Now that little model there can be applied to any number of vendors, right? But basically what we're doing is, like, as I said, we define a set of stakeholders. We ask them how a vendor is doing. That becomes the metric around what we call vendor satisfaction. And that drives the vendor performance as an input. And but instead of sending you off to the broader survey and assessment engine, we've got a module within Vendor Manager Workspace where we've got a predefined set of questionnaires and whatever, and you define your stakeholders. You're probably going to want to change the questions. You're probably, you may already have an approach to that, but we've got a starting point that you can modify and make your own.
Okay, the floor is now open for questions from the group. Anyone have any particular questions for David on anything he's covered so far, as well as just in general? Now's the time. Absolutely,
David,
really love that slide there, David. I just wanted to jump in real quick. I really love that slide. I think it was slide 15. I think that's one of the biggest questions that we get over in customer success. What are the different phases to kind of consider as we're implementing Vendor Manager Workspace? So thank you for presenting that.
Thank you all for joining us today. It was some great questions. And you know what, Emma, your comment, like I said, on the review meetings, just spot on. We're very much aligned. So I'm looking forward to maybe even getting some feedback on you as we go through that journey.
Yeah, no problem. That would be great. Sounds like you're a good person for us to keep in contact with as we're going on this journey too.
Yes, please do, all of you.
Great. Well, I launched
Thank
the poll there for you guys. Go ahead and fill it out before you leave, giving us some feedback. This helps us to revise some of the office hours, get some additional content. But as always, thank you, David, for your time today. And then thank you, customers, for joining. For those listening to this video recording as well, thank you for listening in. We'll keep these going. Next one up is going to be, I believe, ATF at the end of this month. So exciting times ahead. Thanks a lot. And once you finish the poll, go ahead and then log off. Have a great rest of your day.